So welcome, welcome back, everyone. Ray, we'll let you make comments first, and then we'll go to questions from the class or comments from the class. Obviously, you don't have to agree with either of our speakers or any of the particular points made, but this raises a lot of questions about what is the history, particularly as seen from the African American point of view, or the African American history. So Ray, we'll go to you first.
Thanks, Dick. One of the things I forgot to mention, it's in Bill's book. I think it's even in Bitter Fruit, but it certainly is in this as well, is the change in the Daley administration, the second Daley administration from the first Daley administration. Well, Terry's right that there's not the same model of patronage. There's actually a different patronage model that is adopted in the second Daley administration. That's a kind of a pinstripe patronage model, where instead of providing thousands and thousands of patronage level jobs, entry level jobs to get people into the workforce, the idea is to court large corporations by privatizing city services, and in turn those corporations in turn give back to the mayor in terms of campaign contributions, for which there were for a long time no limits. So six-figure donations were not uncommon, even as early as when Daley first ran in 1989, or ran first time successfully in 1989. So this idea that Daley comes in and adopts the reform model, I really want to push back on that, because I think that that's really not the model he developed. This idea that corporations had to be constantly courted, that they were job creators, and more importantly, campaign contributors, was much more the model that Daley followed. And it served, large campaign contributions served to kind of mute opposition to Daley when he ran, because he would start with such a large war chest, and no independent candidate could compete with that. And it led to a lesser, I hate to say it, but lesser and lesser candidates over time against Daley, people who started off having no chance to win, and proved that to be true when they ran. So I think that the model is different, but it's the same idea that certain people are favored and certain people are not. Again, this isn't a model. The pinstripe patronage model is not a model that really includes African Americans, except at the very elite level, and then only a few favored firms.
And Terry, one thing I think you might clarify before we go to questions is you had extensive writings about the new political culture that Daley had adopted, and maybe you can explain what was the new political culture and why was it important that Daley, or in what sense did Richard M. Daley adopt the new political culture?
Yeah, this was a critical example of how Chicago was in part a contradiction with the rest of the country, but in other ways, it was doing the same thing, but it just took longer and it came later. That's where I would say I had insights that my Chicago faculty colleagues generally did not, because Chicago just lagged in this. But I show it in 4 boxes. The dependent variable is the rise of the new political culture. The causes are within the economic, the social, and the government. The economic decline of agriculture and manufacturing, the rise of high tech, higher incomes, general affluence, lead to more of an emphasis on market and market individualism in the economy. Second, social factors, the slimming of the family, decline of the extended family, more education, more media exposure, iPhones, all of this leads to more tolerance of individuals. So this was a small revolution, that is, of social issues rising, not only having new dynamics, but the decline of the simple. So what Ray, I'll tease him here, he's invoking the pinstripe patronage is the old Chicago model. How many voters changed their vote or really loved Chicago because of the pinstripe patronage? Few. What you should look at is not the people getting the big contracts for tearing down the buildings, which I'm also fighting with, but look at the young people who come here during the summer, go to these festivals and say, this is fantastic stuff. I'm moving to Chicago. Chicago is also generating more art school graduates than any city in the country. LA and New York are surpassed by Chicago. These people stay on and they do they go into marketing, advertising, they do web design. And they've changed the city, especially around the north side, but also in Bronzeville and other locations where they're more often African Americans. And people, and some of those move back from the suburbs because they want to have the authenticity of the experience. They're not here for patronage jobs, is what I'm saying. That's the old, that yes, a few are, and there's some aldermen today who will still say, for sure, I like the way Chicago ran under Daley One, and I'm still doing it every bit I can. But most don't say that, and fewer say that now than did in the past. So so the new political culture incorporates these kinds of changes, and I've sort of sketched them briefly. But in terms of Daley One versus Daley Two, examples I focused on, or that is for this course, don't just listen to me and to Ray. Read the book that Judd and read the book on Daley Two, and it builds on my interpretation written up here 10 years before that book. I mean, I presented this before the rest of my colleagues here were talking about it, but a couple of books that come out which occasionally have a footnote to Terry Clark, but not very much. But these ideas are there in the Judd and what's his name
Costa Spiro.
Yeah, Costa Spiro, the Judd and Costa Spiro book on Daley Two. I mean, it's got one, and it plays up the lakefront, the imagery of the lakefront and the like, which then was taken further, of course, by the subsequent mayors. Okay.
Okay, let's go to questions or comments from any of the 30 people who are on the Zoom event. Yes, Sean.
Hello, everybody. Mr. Ladata, I definitely love what you said, because my paper that I'm writing is around the lines of the decentralization of the labor market and how it affected African-American community, affected minority communities. So you gave me a lot of ammunition there in terms of lit. But both of you gentlemen, something that, listening to your presentations, and you talk about the job market, you've talked about the Great Migration, you've talked about, kind of political candidates that were supported by African-American communities that have not, kind of upheld their end. They courted for the vote, but didn't come behind with anything else in terms of jobs, resources, things of the nature. But what I notice is absent from both of your conversation, and maybe it's a reason, and I'd just like to hear more about it, is the drug aspect. That you, part of what was been talked about in terms of the decentralization, kind of went up into the 70s, early 80s, but then, you had the crack epidemic that hit real hard in a lot of these urban communities, and African-American communities, and how that exasperated further certain aspects of poverty and already the disinvestment that was happening. Do you have any thoughts or comments around that? And I guess as we talk about these things, from the decentralization to, as I just threw in the ring, drugs, to politics and finding appropriate representation in local government, how do you see these things shaping our future going forward, now that we're past the Daleys and we have like a Lightfoot who's in office who's touted as a progressive, but what's next?
Okay, two questions. What about the drug epidemic? And one aspect of that, by the way, was the switch in the way police corruption works. And we'll be talking about that next week when we move from the mob paying off the commanders to the street gangs taking over the drugs and paying off the street cops. It changed the whole violence and police abuse case. But Ray and Terry, what about the drug aspects, and what about the future?
I'd be really interested in kind of gaming this out, because I'm not really sure how we'd measure that. maybe it's not a criticism of it as a factor. It's a very important factor. It's a criticism of me for not really being able to figure it out. How would we get to knowing what impact that had, and knowing that we can attribute it to the drug epidemic, to the crack epidemic? So I wanted to see how those factors contributed to economic decline. If anyone has any ideas, I'm really open to it, but I'm trying to figure out how we would separate out the crack epidemic as a separate factor here.
Wouldn't you be able, though, to go at least from the increase in crime in the the African American community to the loss of the African American population? We lost 250,000 African Americans in the last little more than a decade.
Yeah, we're looking at that in the last decade. We're looking at the crack epidemic in '87 probably is the peak, right? So I'm trying to connect the, yeah.
I guess my thoughts, in a small way are, if this sounds rough, I forgive me because I lack the words to say it in, I guess, a softer manner, but crackheads can't work. If they're struggling with drug dependencies and real harsh issues with substance abuse, I would figure there'd be some sort of decline in employment, that stretches what was already happening even more so. And I don't know, I understand what you're saying. How do you measure that? I don't know if you measure the type of crimes. I don't know if you measure people in drug treatment or people that died from drug overdoses. I don't know if those are ways to appropriately measure the impact of the crack epidemic on the African American community. But I don't know, those are just my 2 cents.
Well, I mean, maybe we could look at a particular community which might have had a somewhat robust middle class before the steel mills closed. When the steel mills closed, we see some economic decline, and then we see a greater economic decline with the crack epidemic following that in quick succession. So that might be one way to do it. I'm not sure what everybody else thinks.
These are critical issues, and they're nationally important. This is Chicago, but it's not just Chicago. So there are people who are studying this and it's done more work at Yale Law School, in New York, and Washington, Baltimore, Atlanta, LA. I'm not doing much original work, but I've been to several conferences. A number of my students and others are doing field work. And then also that is the Chicago specific, has been ethnographies in specific neighborhoods like South Shore, Bridgeport, to contrast with Bronzeville and other areas. And I guess I would simply, well, one additional theme I would add along with the drugs is surveillance. And this links the experience of of people with records and people who have problems with the police. And not just the police, but the whole criminal court systems and the surveillance. So something, roughly half of the African-American younger men are being followed by the police. I mean, that they have to turn in records, they have to show up, they have to report what they're doing on a regular basis. And this sense of being supervised is a byproduct of the broken windows theory. That if you have, and so that there are 3 books I'll mention, really 2 by Forrest Stewart, if you haven't seen those. One is on LA, the second's on Chicago, and he worked with the gangs for 4 or 5 years. We biked together. So his quick story is the gangs shifted from their traditional violence, threatening, and collecting money to, guess what? The media. Making videos of themselves, posting them, and then getting fees and following based on the viewership on YouTube. If that's not the rise of culture and following a different from the Irish Catholic dynamic. It's not pinstripe patronage. It's a totally different dynamic involving and he mentions as well, young African Americans watch the social media roughly twice as often as whites of the same age. So there's a connection to this social media activism stuff in ways that demands attention. And second, the police have then given a lot of control. That is, the police are backing off with Lori Lightfoot. But before Lori Lightfoot, the police basically left the gangs a lot of autonomy in distributing the drugs. So the gangs show up and then, around Humboldt Park, they're there. The police have been loose. I don't know how much was payoffs or whatever else, but basically the gangs have been very important in distributing the drugs and control a lot of money and violence. But also then the question is, how do you have surveillance of any of this? And so in New York, they've been visible. You had with Bloomberg and before him, what's his name? The guy with the Italian name. The
Rudy Giuliani.
Giuliani. So Giuliani really implemented this. Then he hired the Boston police chief who had been trained with Jim Wilson on the broken windows theory, toughly implemented in New York, stop and frisk, very tough. And then LA hired him away, and they did the same thing in LA. When Forrest Stewart was doing his field work, he spent 1 year talking to people in one neighborhood where there were homeless and African-American prostitutes, drug dealers, and so forth. And then in came the new police, and they were stopping everybody. And so he has interviews with the people who changed their views, who changed their patterns with the implementation of the broken windows theory in LA. Then the police chief went back to New York, and parts of this you now have in different Chicago neighborhoods. And the Chicago police is doing, in some neighborhoods, it's doing broken windows. In other neighborhoods, it's doing neighborhood autonomy. In other neighborhoods, it's doing white Catholic, keep out the blacks. In other neighborhoods, it's keep out the whites. I mean, that is, we got all kinds of stuff in Chicago right now, which makes, so I would say, rather than saying one of these is right or wrong or is Chicago, I'm in this session, we're mainly stressing simply two dynamics that Ray and I are and but in terms of the dynamic and change in the future, the same book I mentioned before that at Dick's suggestion, The New Political Culture, looks at the 68 events. And there were Black riots were very important in 68, from 65, 68, 69, 70. What happened afterward to mayors? The big change was from 70 to 74. The answer was the taxpayers' revolt. So it wasn't a direct anti-Black, but it was cut the budgets of those cities which have spent, and that is what has happened in the last week in New York. They've elected a Black cop mayor, and he's directly opposed to the policies of his predecessor. And this is at one kind of answer, which we may well get. Toni Preckwinkle is working on running for mayor of Chicago right now. So she is a clear alternative, and everybody thought she would be the next mayor, but Lori Lightfoot came out of, all right. And so I'm not trying to predict, but I'm saying if we look at some of the dynamics, these dynamics are going on both in different Chicago neighborhoods, which we can compare across neighborhoods, but second, across cities. And so because mayors and the big election is the mayor, and different cities are going to be doing this very differently as we detailed city by city, plus the 3 volumes by the group of the 3 political scientists that were all around Berkeley, who studied first 10 cities around in the Bay Area. Then they did it nationally on African Americans in particular, and some Mexicans, and basically showed how these transformed mayoral and general urban policies. And so I would say, yes, pay attention to drugs, but don't see it as deterministic.
Let's take a couple of other comments and questions. Daniel, you were next, and then Tony.
Yeah, I have a comment on the use of segregation data as a measure I think it's important for us to think very carefully about what we're measuring when we measure segregation. Dorothy Pittman talks about this. Huey also talked about it. That desegregation was a strategy adopted by the civil rights movement with the goal of getting the state to invest as much in Black children as it invested in white children, and that a lot of white people mistook it for the end, not the means. So for both of our speakers, I guess because you've both talked about measures of segregation as supporting your argument. What do you think you're measuring when you talk about segregation? Is that a measure of Black power, or is it a measure of the state investment in Black children, or a measure of something else?
Ray, why don't we start with you?
Well, I certainly don't think it's a measure of the state's investment in Black children. I take from Anderson and Pickering's work, Confronting the Color Line, that there are three main emphases of the civil rights movement: desegregation, integration, and Black power. They each went in a different direction. Desegregation was the idea of just removing the legal barriers that were in place to enforce segregation. Integration was much more intentional in terms of actually creating integrated communities that, by the measures that are most commonly used still to this day of racial concentration in geographic areas. And then Black power, which is to say integration is not necessarily the goal, but increasing resources to Black communities, even segregated Black communities, is the goal, and that should be what is emphasized. So I don't necessarily see it as a strategy to necessarily bring resources. I see it as something that was created by outside forces and then is adapted to by residents of the communities.
Terry, your comments?
Yeah, I would answer first as a resident of Bronzeville. This is one of the biggest divisions within Bronzeville. How much you favor openly, explicitly, or not integration versus segregation. And so I was in one meeting with about 20 civic leaders from Bronzeville, including Mrs. Barack Obama. People got along well with her. In the middle of the meeting, Mr. Barack Obama came into the meeting, and 4 or 5 people said, "Oh, sellout! What's he doing here? What are you doing in this place?" And then when he left 10 minutes later, and people then all leaned toward her, saying, "We support your," and the image was the front page of the New Yorker magazine. Has a picture of her with bullets across her chest and him wearing a Nehru outfit. Within that family and within the, okay, I won't go on, but I'm saying there's a lot of evidence there for looking at this. These are multiple complicated meanings. I have 3 new chapters in the book on trees and real violence. And one has a new section on Tony Preckwinkle and on this, which is there. The segregation. I mean, this is what my colleague, my demographic colleague who wrote a book, called American Apartheid. He's crazy. I mean, that he's imposing his demographic imagery incorrectly in a political and so we argued a lot at sessions. And when he brought in data, actual data on how much do people work with or dislike people of different ethnic background, he got very different results. So I'm not saying that there's not racism, but that there are different views of that a measure of living together or living apart is not a measure of racism and so Richard in Florida again has had a famous paper, Florida and Gates. The more gays you have, the more high-tech jobs. are the percentage of gays in a neighborhood a measure of tolerance, a measure of LGBTQ, a measure of segregation, or what? And so I then countered and said, let's get some actual data on what people do. And it contradicts in the sense that you can have a large number of gays, but you then can also have people who are fighting with the gays. So having segregation or not is so. Now my quick bottom line is Dick Simpson's book on the history of the council is a better guide to segregation than the demographic data. That is that there were battles going on where you had murders in the 1910s. This was Al Capone City, Merritt Thompson, so I would say, and there are a lot of sociologists today, demographers or demographically inspired, who just look at racial segregation or including, say, different kinds of Asian, ethnic, and they don't look in how to interpret the meaning of this or to connect this to views of ethnic collaboration and working together. I'll cite one. The other book I didn't get to is by Joseph Yee on God and Karate on the South Side is the title of the book. Brilliant book, God and Karate on the South Side. And what he pursues are young African-American men, say 15 to 30. Basically, what are the alternatives? They choose themselves. They're alienated from their mothers. They quit school. They don't know who their fathers are. But he found four things that they do join: martial arts, evangelical religion, Soko Gakkai, and a direct sales organization that was a Japanese inspired. So all these organizations basically say you've got to change your life, you got to have self-discipline, you got to work hard, and you've got to have the focus of doing your homework. And your martial artist master tells you, did you do your homework? How much time did you spend doing your homework last night? Oh, I was too busy. 20 push-ups right now. Okay, that kind of discipline is operating in ways. The other, just one more quick name, Theaster Gates. Look at what Theaster Gates is doing. Look at what Joseph E. writes about. These are embedded with the meaning of race and building institutions that will help especially young, poor African-American men and women who are dealing with them in various ways, that provide many avenues for change and improvement. And in one conference, there was an NPR broadcast on this about a month ago by criminology experts, and they were, one of them listed 25 things in Chicago that are working. They're small, they're underfunded, but there are many things which are dealing with crime. And one other quick conference, from about 1400 to present, crime has been going down. We have less crime. And crime, we have much less crime now than we did in the 60s in Chicago. I biked the other night.
Could you put in the chat the link to the oral history, because it's still underutilized, and I think the people in the class would like that, or if Jake can put it in.
Sure.
Tony, your question or comment?
Yes. Mr. Clark spoke earlier, and he was talking about like the drugs, and when he got to talking back on the drugs and the killers, and he mentioned social media quite a few times, and how much you find African-American males on social media. I was wondering, are there any studies currently going on to identify the impact and role that social media has on the crimes and different things that are going on? Because if you look at it, a lot of people that these young people are following, Instagram and TikTok, they have blue checks, and they're what they call certified, but they're getting paid by the social media platforms to continue to portray and show vigilante style or ignorance amongst the community. So is there any type of studies that's going along with the social media side to add with everything else?
Shall I respond?
Sure.
Yeah, social media is not part of our study.
Just quickly. The main, I'd say the main thing in an ethnographic Chicago mode is the same guy I mentioned, Forrest Stewart. He's now assistant or associate professor, whatever, at Stanford Sociology Department. And the book is entitled Battle of the Bullet. And it shows how the social media and building a social media reputation for yourself. Some of these guys are in gangs, many are not in gangs. So it's not just the gangs, they're individuals who are posting their videos and how they're building up their social media following. So he's got a lot of detail on who does the editing of these, who makes them work, how do they get promoted, and so forth. I was going to add, there's a woman at Princeton in sociology who's worked more on surveillance and those issues, but the social media more specifically, there's lots of work in progress right now. A lot of it's unpublished, a lot of it's very new. It's very, very important, but it hasn't been seriously pulled together well. There's a book by a woman who's the chairman of the journalism, has a different communications department at UIC. Dick, I think you remember her name. She has a great
Zizi
name.
Papadromas.
Yeah, say it again slowly.
Zizi, Z-I-Z-I Papadromas.
Okay, Zizi Papadromas. Okay, maybe you need to put that up as well. But she has a great book on social media and how the Green Revolution in Egypt took off through the use of social media in getting people to come and protest together. So that and then she has a lot of ethnographic material. She has a lot of the press coverage, and she gave a talk. Building on that with people who are doing, and there's a big MA program here at the USC, and there are a lot of people studying these kinds of issues with fancy quantitative data, and they're joining it with these other kinds of data. So I would say there's look for what you specifically are interested in, but I mean the number which Forrest cited, that African Americans do this more, I think it is probably in many different places if you look at national surveys.
So before we go back to Sean, is there anybody else who would like to make a comment or a question? Sean, go ahead.
Okay, just real quick, just a couple of things. I actually met Professor Forrest at University of Chicago a couple of years back. This may have been 17 or 18, and I'm not sure if he was working on that book that you are speaking of, Mr. Clark, the book about the social media and the street gangs here in Chicago. But I did have to read his other book about Skid Row in LA, and that was very interesting because a lot of the movement, as far as the police moving the homeless people, dealt around gentrification in its proximity to downtown LA. But that's another issue. What I wanted to touch back on, as far as the social media thing, I guess I want to add, I don't know if I could add a layer to what you're talking about, Mr. Clark. It's the aspect of number one, it's not so much like regular people jumping on these social media platforms and then, getting the blue check, as Tony was talking about, where they're kind of recognized as a public figure and then the crime happens. It's more or less, these guys are like, they want to be rappers, first and foremost. So, with that comes, I need a certain level of support. I need a certain level of backers, almost like a politician. So their backers are who? Easy answer. They're gang members, the people that live on their block, the people that they're in the gang with. Those begin their supporters. Now, you can start adding this up. You have rappers who need attention, you have gang members as supporters, and then you have social media. So you put all this stuff together, gang members are going to do illegal criminal activities, and they're filming it or calling out other gang members or other opposition. And that leads to more drama, more violence, more problems. So I guess I'm just saying this to add somewhat of a narrative to what Professor Stewart was trying to do and what he was trying to achieve with that study. So it's not just like random people. These are people that have things going on, but they're using it in a negative way, if that makes sense to you. They're unlike a politician that's looking for, well, I guess, we got a lot of bad politicians here, but outside of those that are looking for like negative support, looking for positive support, these rappers that are slash gangbangers are looking for negative support that pushes them and makes them just as controversial. So I just wanted to say that last thing, and I'll stop. I guess this is more my question. To the drug thing again, I know we kind of jumped past that, but the only reason why I bring it up is because drugs as a whole can be an economic driver. So it depends on which side of the coin you're on. If you're the person selling it, think about it. We talked about deindustrialization. We talk about a lot of jobs being lost, a lot of poor and like messed up people financially. What becomes an easy alternative? Sell drugs. It's black market. You're going against the man. You're making your own way. You're doing your own thing. So it becomes a industry on its own. But then on the other side, obviously, you can't have a business unless you have customers. So when we talk about the high numbers of people using drugs that are spending money or committing crime, doing whatever to get the drugs, that becomes another economic factor. So you have spenders and you have buyers. So you may or may not be able to answer this question, but I guess my thing is I would like to see what is the causal relationship between the job market fading away and then the drug market blowing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
So, Ray, you wanted to go?
No, I'm saying that's an excellent point. I hope there's some data on that, but I don't know where I'd find it. But it's certainly something I'd be interested in looking into.
Ray, maybe just continuing a bit. You told us, sort of the story of the book that you're working on up through maybe the 80s or the 90s. How are you going to end the book? That is, where you were talking about the 4 institutions and how they changed or how they were blocks, and how do you see coming to a conclusion of the book if you've gotten to the place in the arc where you're trying to bring it to conclusion?
I think we're gonna find that none of the institutions provided a clear and ongoing path for upward mobility for African Americans in any of the eras. So I think the conclusion comes to that last point I made about exit. That African Americans tried a number of different ways to become included in Chicago and to advance in Chicago. It was better than the rural South in the early part of the 20th century, but it's kind of run its course for a lot of African Americans who have decided that Chicago doesn't hold promise anymore for advancement or upward mobility. So I think that's where I'm headed. I think that'll be faithful to Bill's original work.
Go ahead, Terry.
Yeah, two quick comments. One is don't give social media and rap over totally to the anti-establishment anti-middle class. That is, Kanye West, the #1 hip hop singer, recorded Christian rap. And I just looked on the web now, and it lists the 10 best Christian rappers, hip hop artists from 2017 onward. Christian rap is an effort to redefine what is on social media and what is rap in ways that can include and link with gospel and the Christian tradition and more so-called middle-class lifestyle. So, and that this is bottom up, I would say, more than top down. Second, to link this to politics more directly, Robert Vargas, was an assistant, now is tenured at the USC here. He did a book on his Northwestern PhD, was on the little village neighborhood. And he contrasts the halves. There are two halves of it. One has very high crime rate and murders, difficulties in the streets all the time. The other half has coherence. People The gangs work with the alderman. They re-elect the alderman. He pays them off with patronage jobs. It works in the old Chicago style. I'm simplifying a little bit, but basically they have a lot of money for social worker and for testing out these kinds of programs that help the guys themselves, as well as reducing crime. The second neighborhood, the second half of the same neighborhood, is gerrymandered among 3 or 4 different aldermen, and nobody cares about the folks in the Pilsen neighborhood, Pilsen/Little Village, and in that way they have 2 very different politicized, and that is the surveillance, the type of surveillance changes, the type of linkage to the political system changes, the specific incentives and the types of gangs which you, and the activities that gangs pursue are different. Instead of electing the alderman, as they do in half the ward, and the other half of the ward, they're fighting the alderman, they're fighting the city, they're fighting the mayor, and they're alienated. So each of these, and he details in a couple of 100 pages, these 2 styles in one neighborhood. So don't overgeneralize and look at the neighborhood and political specifics is my bottom line here, whether it's for RAP, for Black integration, or measures of segregation, that look at the meaning as well as the crude data.
I think we may be at the end of the conversation. We have more time if there are any last questions or any last comments that anybody wants to make. Well, we thank our 2 presenters. Those of you from UIC, if you want to stay and talk about your paper and your current work, that's fine. I'm going to stop.